Thanks for joining us on the panel for this afternoon session. We'll kind of jump right in here. My name is Joshua Hatcher. I work for Asurion in our security team. With us today is Mark Geeslin from Ramsey Solutions and Ramadoss from AWS. So we're hoping to cover a few topics. If you have questions, please post them to us and we'll jump into those as well. But I want to jump over to Mark first and get his take on something. So, Mark, over time, we're starting to shift into serverless, but we see a lot of the same kind of security paradigms happen over time. So I wanted to get your take and your thoughts on, how do we keep security front and center as we make this shift into serverless? What mistakes have you seen people commit kind of on a repetitive basis? What things do we need to look out for as we're shifting to serverless?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here. I guess before I mention the mistakes, if it's all right, I just want to mention being a security professional. Just want to mention, as a security leader, I actually love serverless, right? From a security perspective, because serverless eliminates entire classes of vulnerabilities associated with infrastructure that have always been elusive and difficult to deal with. Yeah. They're still there. They're on the back now, though, of the cloud service provider rather than on the back of the companies developing the software. So I just love it for that reason, as well as the fact that if it's like pure serverless, it makes it extremely difficult for the attacker to gain persistence, which is, of course, one of their chief goals and objectives in attacking you. So I love it, but you're right. Some very similar mistakes are being made that have been made from the beginning of time in terms of software development, anyway. And some of them are general. Some of them I'll mention a few general ones and then a few specific ones. One of the things I see over and again has been continued inadequate attention, I guess is the best way to say it, to security in the early stages of development. And that has always been the case. It's still the case in the serverless and cloud environments, right? In some ways, it's improving because we as an industry continue to emphasize shift left, and it's actually catching on, right? And it's happening, but it's still an issue. I still see, particularly at medium and smaller companies, a lack of threat modeling and like inside of their development process, right? So, and there's really no excuse for not doing that other than, not maybe being aware of it or maybe feeling like they don't have the time to, but with rapid risk assessments and really streamlined threat modeling, it's not a heavy burden. And that's something that is continuing to be a mistake because and with all the increased emphasis on automation and in the security space, increased emphasis on automation, with SAST and SCA and DAST and all kinds of stuff, folks can possibly be thinking, hey, it's less important, right? The design side of security, but it's not. It's just as important as it's always been. It's critical, and we can't rely upon these other mechanisms of automation to save us. We still need to think security at all stages of the life cycle. So that's one general one I would say, and the other one would be which is something Eric Johnson hit on. He was speaking of it from a different angle, but it's essentially the same thing, and it's inadequate or incorrect use of the platform services that are available to us. So he was talking about, he didn't put it this way, but essentially we always say, don't roll your own when we're talking about crypto. Well, don't roll your own, right? Security services, when they're available from the platform, right? Make use of them. And you need to master them in order to use them properly. And this is not new to serverless and cloud. It's been around all along, right? Folks that have written Java code before back in the Stone Age, like me, simple thing like random number generation, right? It's critical to get a cryptographically secure random number, pseudo-random number for security purposes. Folks would still use like the random class rather than a secure random class. So they're using the wrong API call. And the similar things happen in the cloud and serverless space, either using APIs incorrectly or services incorrectly, or not being aware of them and trying to do it your own way rather than using what the platform is providing you. Yeah. So I'd say that's a huge one there.
What, out of those two, the first one obviously has a huge impact to the organizational security as a whole. Which of those two do you think is going to surface as having a greater impact for serverless as we move forward?
Well, the first one about more design emphasis is really not specific to serverless at all, right? It's just that it's been an issue all along, and it's not going away. So we need to continue to focus on it, and not think that somehow or another the cloud and serverless are going to eliminate this. It's just going to be with us forever. So it's but I think specifically to serverless, and this was just mentioned by Jim in the last talk, is the complexity of the platforms, right? There's just so much available that it's so difficult to master it, but we really do need to master it. So I think specifically for serverless, that one maybe I would highlight, and that organizations need to really invest in mastering these platforms in creating a culture of continuous learning, of support for that learning, and the resources available for the learning, the training, and hiring the folks with the experience. All of that, you got to master it. You can't just dive in this space and kind of when you're not adequately prepared, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, with the do you think the biggest tenet there with mastery is going to be the training you were talking about? Like what's going to be the biggest stepping stone to mastery for an organization to kind of pick up those security capabilities?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's largely it's just folks just don't know, right? So they haven't had the training, adequate training. But in addition, oftentimes in some organizations, right, they don't feel like they have the time, right? They're just trying to get things out so fast. And I'm all for that. I'm like total strong advocate for moving quickly and DevSecOps and all of that. But you do have to know what you're doing, right? Or you are going to open up some security holes. So yeah. So those are a couple of the general ones. We can go at some point maybe into some specifics if we have time, but around Lambda and in the AWS environment, or secrets management, or is another very common fail where folks again are not using what's available to them with Secrets Manager and AWS. So.
Yeah, I mean you mentioned it, right? The going fast can become a challenge if you're at the same time trying to balance really controlling and mastering those systems like you're talking about. And Mark, you threw out this buzzword, and it'll lead me to my question for Uma today, which it has to do with shifting left, right? And that's what we're constantly trying to do, is shift left into that entire dev workflow. So Uma, the question for you has to do with it shifting left, right? And in software development in general, adding security controls to that environment, but specific to serverless, what type of advice would you give to security professionals that are responsible for being involved in that shift left?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have seen some confusion around that topic. I mean, this is something that we've been talking throughout in the day-to-day. Serverless enables us to focus on business logic. We're not thinking about servers. So we are basically operating on a higher level of abstraction. So the traditional tools are security measures we use for network security or infrastructure security. That is kind of changed now. That's now the responsibility of the cloud provider with serverless. But at the same time, like much of the security practices we use for protecting the workloads, like scanning of your source code, or making sure third-party dependencies are not having any vulnerabilities, they are up to date, or sanitizing the code, or sanitizing the input, or like making sure you don't have inputs in the secrets in your code. These are some of the practices that are common between traditional development where you deploy it in a server or a serverless environment. But if you ask me, it probably better to understand the landscape And the security professionals need to understand the unique challenges of serverless over traditional development. First of all, serverless makes it easy to develop microservice event-driven based applications, right? So much of the benefits and also the challenges of developing microservice architecture comes into serverless as well. So where is that unique challenge? Like instead of running in on-prem, you're running in cloud, running long-running servers. Now we are running ephemeral stateless servers right now, which runs your code parallelly. And instead of writing a lot of code, we are preferring managed services with configurations, right? For example, take about a API that's API-based microservice written in Node.js Express. You take away some of the routing and those related code and use API gateway. You might be, breaking a big monolith component into smaller component, use a orchestration service. So you're writing a lot of configuration, you're writing a lot of managed services. Now, if you think about that stateless or ephemeral nature, I'm not sure like where that line blurs, because stateless is being, running stateless, managing state in an external storage is part of a 12-factor principle, right? So I believe the challenge is serverless makes it mandatory. It adheres to that principle. So now state has to be maintained in an external storage. Jeremy showed a diagram where like we had several components. Now your serverless architecture looks like that. A bigger architecture with several moving parts. You have fine-grained microservices running in managed compute, and you're using a lot of managed services. You're using a lot of configurations. Now, the decision to use the managed service or build architecturally aware microservices it is all taken during the design phase. Now, so is that we also are talking about or thinking about how to provide access controls between these managed service and your compute and everything. That is also done during your design phase. And your configurations and everything evolve during your development. So security is not something that only comes in the beginning and then comes at the end. I remember when I was developing like a long time ago, we used to do an security architecture review with an architecture diagram in the beginning of your application. That's not going to happen. It's something that happens throughout your application delivery lifecycle. So it could be somebody, a security delegate that's within, embedded into your development team, or someone within your team that wears that security hat. You constantly check your guardrails, you are developing within that boundary, and you are able to develop faster as well, because security is an enabler. It's not something a blocker for cloud adoption or serverless adoption. So long story short, we are operating at a higher level, right? But we have a shared responsibility between the cloud provider and the developer or the customer. So cloud provides the infrastructure and network security, but also offers different tools to protect your workload. If you take AWS, we've got identity and access management service to control access to service. You got web application firewalls, API authentication and authorizations. And like we also have more customizable configurations. Like if it's configurations, but if your workload demands much better security, of course you can customize those configurations using customer managed keys, or you can also use code signing. So there are different tools. So security professionals come in to learn different types of tools. I think this is repeated in today's session as well. And Mark also mentioned it's integrated deeply into the software delivery lifecycle. That's something security professionals need to know about, when you move to serverless.
Yeah, and you mentioned a lot of things there that become valuable over time for these teams putting solutions into a cloud environment. And you mentioned things like having somebody do architecture reviews throughout development, looking at different architectures and the way that they're changing for serverless. And you mentioned, you started to lead a little bit into where we get into security of the cloud versus security in the cloud, AWS versus Azure responsibilities and the customer responsibilities. What's your recommendation for, say, teams that are in the cloud and kind of maintaining visibility on all those pieces you outlined, right? There were so many pieces and things that you kind of mentioned there. And you mentioned a couple of good solutions, right? Having someone that is security focused that's on the team and doing those reviews throughout, looking at capabilities that are of your cloud provider. Do you have a recommendation for somebody to be able to kind of look into those situations, or a good way to keep tabs on the things they need to pay attention to?
Mm-hmm. It depends. I have seen in different ways of people doing it. One of the things I have seen is security delegates. They are part of a security team, but then kind of a matrix into a development team. So this kind of a setup, or like an organizational setup, is really helpful during the initial stages of cloud adoption, because your development team now is a need to learn a lot of new technologies. There's a lot of learning curves. They now have to learn about infrastructure as code. They also have to play a role of an operator, right? And now they also have to play a role of a security professional. Is a little bit different. So having somebody embedded into the team as a security professional and transition that knowledge over to the team over a period of time, so that within the team itself, you kind of develop that habit or culture. That I have seen as something that initially started and then get into the being part of the team.
Yeah, I completely agree. As someone who has to do some of that today, I 100% agree.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I do have a question for you, Josh, because we're talking about developer productivity, because security is the enabler for developer productivity. It's not a blocker for adoption. It is, and it is also the greatest benefit of serverless, right? So in your experience, when dealing with compliance and regional restrictions, how can you empower developers while ensuring compliance requirements?
Yeah, I think the empowerment is in what you said, right? It's setting up that initial foray into security for developers to lean on. Security is not a hurdle. Compliance isn't a hurdle if you build it in as a requirement. So if you build it in as a framework up front, and that the developers can use, understand, and even augment to benefit their platform, it doesn't become a hurdle. It becomes part of a benefit for the entire organization. So that's how you kind of eliminate that hurdle. But making it, and for empowering developers, it's about giving them some ownership of that security that's for their platform, right? And saying, this isn't a hurdle, this is something you own as a development team, this is something that you're responsible for, but at the same time, you have those resources you're talking about, right? Those security adjuncts that can help guide teams to where they need to be. So I think that's part of it. You mentioned the regional restrictions. That's part of compliance. Every organization deals with a different set of compliance requirements. And some of those are regional, but really they just fold into compliance. And I think if you're trying to hit a compliance flow for most development teams, there's some intangibles and tangibles, right? Your intangibles become your relationships. They become the things that you need to make sure you maintain and establish. Most of the time, there's not a bridge, right? There's not that security resource in a lot of cases that you're talking about who would know all of the compliance applications, as well as know the development input, and to be able to pull those together for teams to rely on. That's tough to come by. But what you're looking for is relationships in that intangible manner. So you're bringing in legal, you're bringing in compliance, you're bringing in audit, you're bringing in those pieces, you bring those people to the table. And as long as that's brought in as part of a baseline set of requirements for the organization, we can't think of it as a requirement for the product specifically. We think of it as a requirement for the organization. And so those are built in as baselines for every organizational team, right? So that's that intangible. Go build the relationships and recognize those people have a seat at the table. You've got to step into those conversations willingly and earnestly to make sure you're getting everything out of those resources that you can to build your requirements as a developer. If you don't have good requirements, you're going to end up doing rework at the end or in the middle. And that's not going to make anybody happy. But investing in those relationships or the intangibles is kind of where you want to be. And then you mentioned some of the kind of tangible things we want to have, right? We want to automate things. Mark talked about automation, working towards the code scanning and evaluation of our platforms and systems from a security standpoint, but doing so in an automated way will put you in a compliance path. You get to the end or even the middle of your project and the auditor comes and says, hey, I need your pen test report, or hey, I need your vulnerability assessment. That's going to be a lot easier to do if you have built in that framework and built in that automation up front for yourself to rely on, right? It's a lot better if you're able to kick off a project and you have integrated libraries that help you do code assessments And that way, oh, look, I got a report in my inbox, even though I didn't have to go do a lot of manual work to get it up and running. So that puts you in a great place. That's tangible piece. Whether it doesn't matter if your compliance is HIPAA, PCI, SOX, GDPR, CCPA, or any of them. A lot of those things are not going to give you those real tangible things that are requirements. PCI is one of the closest, but they're not going to give you all those little real concrete pieces of information. So build those relationships to get the intangibles. Those people can help you with some of those vagaries from some of the frameworks, and then go put in the actual tangible work to build automation to put that compliance into your development chain. And I think you end up saving a lot of the time on the back end. So I know we don't have a lot of time as a group today. So I do want to give us all an opportunity to talk about one additional topic. Also, if anybody has questions for us, please put them out there, and we'll try to tackle those as well in our last 8 minutes. The last one is a little bit of what we've talked about as a group today. It's about guardrails for different teams. So we all know AWS, we have some familiarity with, and Azure putting services out there into the world for teams to use and to build upon. Serverless specifically, though, sometimes puts us at a little bit of I'll say legacy disadvantage, right? Historically, we have visibility into the platforms and systems that we deploy, right? Even the full backend stack we had visibility to, so we could provide assurances for the security stack that doesn't really exist with serverless. We, however, do gain the benefits that Mark was talking about with respect to serverless. So, from a guardrails perspective, I'll come back to you first. What do you think about from a guardrails perspective for serverless adoption?
Yeah, I understand there is wide range of services, managed services, and there is a lot of managed services coming in very often. But it's a good thing because if you have a new service coming in, it's solving a complex problem, avoiding lot of boilerplate. Like Eric mentioned, is like your code is the most brittle thing in your application. So it's a good thing, but at the same time, I understand it actually enlarges or makes this landscape bigger. So it adds one more service that we also have to evaluate from a risk perspective, threat perspective. So, but one thing I have seen is it usually start with a basic thing. I think that's a concept of platform onboarding, like know what this service brings into the table, right? And understand what the service is, and then build foundational control over it. And then allow your developer to experiment. The whole thing about serverless is to, realize the benefit of agility. So have multiple environments, have an environment for prototype, test, dev, and production. In your experimentation or prototype environment, allow your developers to innovate much faster with little control. And at the same time, you don't want to bring in risk to your, but they have to innovate much faster. So during that time, also assess the service and build controls with the developer to, impose that control. One of the things that is needed to implement that framework is an enabler. You need that. Like I have seen some customers have cloud center of excellence, right? And it's not, I'm defining it as loosely. It's not, it doesn't have to be official. It's a kind of a triage of architects, security professionals and DevOps teams. They work together to understand what needs to be automated, what needs to be done to enable the developers to go faster, at the same time provide them repeatable ways to do things faster, right? So that's something that I have seen in the past. Like I also want to definitely, as practitioners, what do you do, right? In implementing guardrails for this wide range of systems, managed services.
That's right. Mark, I want to get your take on that as well. I thought that was 100% on the nose there. I mean, it can be very challenging. You need a center of excellence. I couldn't disagree with that at all. Mark, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. Well, yeah, agree with what Uma said. That was I would also throw in there like a completely different angle on it. And then I don't know if it's fair to call it guardrails, but rather than emphasizing always, and we're not, I know we all agree on this, but you can't prevent every mistake, right? So we have to be prepared to quickly detect, right, and respond. So that, I think of that as an additional guardrail, if you will. So we do want to build the guardrails that kind of direct folks in the right direction to begin with, but at the same time, we know that's not going to solve all the problems. So we have to be prepared and have the monitoring in place and the fabric in place, if you will, to be able to detect deviations, if you will, from the guardrails, essentially. So, and be able to respond to those quickly. And I know in organizations I worked in, that was done fairly well. So it's both of those sides working together to keep us on the right path, is both the prevention as well as the detection.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's really speaking to a security net almost that's underneath that guardrail, right? So when somebody breaks through that guardrail, as you very astutely said, they will, because it will happen, that there's at least some sort of net below them to catch it. So we'll have a center of excellence, UMA, for our cloud governance that's going to help us manage that, put in those guardrails, hopefully with services that are provided by the cloud provider, right, to give us some of that visibility. And then, beyond that, we have the monitoring, right, the security net to help us monitor and kind of catch some of those issues if they're out of band issues, right, they're kind of unseen. We did have a question pop up. I'll just read this one from Scott. If you start embedding business logic into services, then how do you see your bus logic as a whole? Also, how do you avoid the scenario where you have a change to bus logic in an early step only to have it reversed or ignored by another service? And I can repeat that one if we need to. Mark, I'll let you take a crack at that one first if you'd like.
Okay, I thought you were going to answer it, Josh.
Oh, I can take a shot at it as well.
Yeah, it's not entirely clear on where he's going, he or she's, with that question, but it was
business logic is what I think it is.
Business logic, yeah, of how you're embedding it in your service. I mean, that's where it's going to go, right? I mean, it's just an different architectural approach, right? Essentially, microservice approach, except we're implementing those through serverless. So that comes into in the early stage of how we're architecting it, right, and how we're going to actually distribute that through these services. So
yeah, I think it's a matter of recognizing how you intend to use the services, and being able to understand where that end is, right? What is the limitation of the service and your choice of its limitation, right? How are you choosing to do the implementation is going to have an impact on how that service reacts and the impact of the other services that are behind it, right? There's a mention about it having it change the other services and having impact down the line. It's a matter of planning and understanding the back-end services well enough to understand what their capacities are, and then being able to put the business logic in place. You mentioned it, Mark, right there where you expect it to be into the services, and then kind of being able to understand where those are going to end and another service will pick up. But it can be tough. I think that was all of our questions, and we are at time. So Mark and Uma, thank you so much. I appreciate the time on the panel this afternoon, and thank everyone else for joining us today. And I think that's it.
Thank you.
Everyone have a good rest of the day.
Great to be here.
All right. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.